Então, bem-vinda, Alex
Obrigada.
Reza. A Alex é Junior Research Fellow em Trinity College, na Universidade de Oxford. Tem um PhD, um doutoramento na área dos estudos franceses e portugueses. E por isso a sua área de investigação é, digamos, num cruzamento entre estudos pós-coloniais, literatura comparada, pensamento político também, não é? A sua pesquisa mais recente, acho eu que ainda é mais recente, não sei,
Vamos ver.
está centrada na imprensa e na cultura de imprensa, no cinema e na rádio, em Conakry, não é?
Sim, exatamente.
Na década de 60. E eu acho que tenho que dizer também, eu aposto que isto é uma introdução que toda a gente faz, mas a Alex também foi nomeada uma das, qual é a expressão, deixa cá ver, one of the 10 new generation thinkers
Oh my God, sim.
by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. There was only 10 of these and she got the award. So well done, Alex. You must be really proud.
Thank you.
And today she's going to... já mudei para inglês. E hoje vai-nos então falar sobre a pesquisa atual, mas mais centrada também nas questões de género, não é? Por isso, obrigada, Alex, é um prazer estar aqui contigo hoje.
Mas pronto, é um prazer para mim estar aqui com vocês também. Eu vou falar em inglês, mas obviamente vocês podem, por questões em inglês ou em português. Vou tentar share my screen. Okay, so I make the switch now to English. Attendez. But I'm in France at the moment, so I'm also speaking in French, and so switching between French and Portuguese and English I find very confusing. But there we go. So yeah, thank you so much, Louisa, and also Laish, and all of you for having me. It's great to speak to you, and hopefully I'll get a sense of some of the things that you're working on, and we already have that, but it would be great. So I'm going to give this paper. I mean, we're such a small group that if you have questions also whilst I speak, then just let me. We can make this more discursive. But I'm going to talk today about women and work, I suppose, in anti-colonial histories. Through the prism of Mensagem, the journal of the Casa dos Estudantes do Império in Lisbon, published between 1948 and 1964. I'm going to focus on the work of three writers associated with that journal, Noemi Souza, Mozambican, and from São Tomé, Alda Espírito Santo and Manuel Margarido. But before I get to talking about their work, I want to talk about some questions of method and historiography that arise when working on women in the decolonizing kind of conjuncture of the 20th century, and particularly in the literary and artistic sphere. And I imagine this will resonate with a lot of you, because I think these questions emerge more broadly.
Alex, can you speak louder, a bit louder, please? Because I'm not listening to you very well.
Is this better, like this?
It is much better, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to speak into this microphone then. So I'm going to talk about these women's work writing in the second half of this talk, but I want to talk first about some questions of method and historiography that have seemed to me very important in working on their work and on this journal more broadly. So a lot of scholarship has kind of critiqued the omission of gender as a central dimension in the work of many kind of anti-colonial great men. And along with the kind of practiced marginalization of women in a lot of anti-colonial practice, this omission of gender alongside race and class as a kind of as a category in thinking about the anti-colonial represents a major blind spot in otherwise resonant visions of social and political transformation that we find in the writing of the anti-colonial moment. And in the case of the Casa and Mensagem, as Inocencia Mata has emphasized, whilst the Casa may be increasingly celebrated as a liberatory space in the history of the struggle against Portuguese colonialism and fascism, and as much as it may have been an incubator of anti-colonial consciousness, it remained a patriarchal space, underpinned by norms of sociality that marginalized women. So few women occupied editorial or decision-making positions, for example, and as such, I think we need to read both the Casa and the journal Mensagem as institutions of power that both encoded exclusionary practices as well as sites of liberatory expression. Can you hear me better now?
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay, cool. So although I'm going to talk about these women's work, therefore I find it kind of important to emphasize that they're very, that their kind of marginality to Mensagem. So Noemi de Souza only published 2 poems in the journal Mensagem, and only one by Manuela Margarido appeared. I mean, Mensagem did publish the work of other writers too, notably Alda Lara, and the illustrations of Noemia Delgado. And this is one of them on the right here, this 1962 Mensagem cover. But this is only a very small part of the journal's content. Actually, on Noemia Delgado in this cover, I've been sort of in the last couple of weeks working on the Nigerian journal Black Orpheus, which was published from Ibadan in Nigeria from 1959, and there they also had this kind of Africanist iconography on the cover, which was also done by a white woman artist, Suzanne Wenger, who's an Austrian artist. And I think there's an interesting question about the ways in which this idea of kind of traditional African iconography is kind of produced by white women. And that seems increasingly a question we should ask, kind of, why did they kind of want to make this claim to kind of traditional iconography, and what are the politics of that? But anyway, so I've said that, you know, that these women are marginal to the journals, but one of the things that I find interesting in the experience of reading Mensagem today is that we are nevertheless confronted with these glimpses and these fragments of women's work. So women aren't invisible in the journal, but they're partially visible. So this is some examples of cover pages, and you can see there's this piece by Alda Espírito Santo, and underneath it there's this other kind of quite cryptic character, Marilisa. And so one of the things that is interesting about journals is that because of the kind of number of authors that you kind of are confronted by in this case, you can sort of start to pick out the work of women who were not then later necessarily anthologized or whatever. And so in that sense, I think that this journal and also other journals that were published at the time can be a kind of very suggestive archive for kind of bringing forth and thinking about women in anti-colonial histories. And so this kind of partial visibility, which I think is different to invisibility, if you see what I mean. But, you know, this partial visibility is a kind of a feature more broadly of the kind of literary and artistic archives of anti-colonial women's work and networks, which are characterized, I think, by this kind of tantalizing but unrealizable promise. So fragments gesture to international networks of engaged literary women that never really fully come into view. So in the Casa archive, for example, there is a file of unpublished poems by a writer, T.G., probably Teresa Gama, who dedicates poems to Alda Lara. Then Alda Espírito Santo, who dedicates texts to the Angolan militant Diolinda Rodrigues. And then archived letters from Noemia de Souza in Mário Pinto de Andrade's archive refer to meetings with Alda Lara in the years after they left Lisbon. She also talks about meetings with Christiane Diop, who was one of the editors of Présence Africaine, which was a journal published in Paris. But what did they discuss? We don't know. We have these kind of external circumstantial historical details that these meetings took place, but the content of the meeting is not available to us. Alda Espírito Santo also talked about plays that she had written that had later been lost, and about meetings in Lisbon with Noemi de Sousa and Maria Vilhena, who was married to Amilcar Cabral, among others. But records of those meetings, which were apparently literary and political in nature, appear to have been lost too. So the question kind of begins to emerge, what do we do with that? Another example is that the filmmaker Sarah Maldoror, who was a francophone but sort of involved in lots of ways in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism, talked later in an interview about how soldiers from the Algerian FLN, the Front National, Front de Libération Nationale, the liberation movement in Algeria, had confiscated reels of film that she had shot in 1971 about women in the liberated parts of Guinea-Bissau. So the footage had been the raw material for a film that she was making called Des Fusils pour Banta, which I suppose, Guns for Banta, but it was about the role of PAIGC women in the armed struggle. So the FLN, she said, took the reels after she was deemed to have been rude to an Algerian soldier who was escorting her, and the film was never made. And I suppose what that vignette kind of illustrates is not just the erasures that attend the archiving of women's, and especially Black women's work, but also the complicity of supposedly liberatory forces in the processes of silencing and destruction. So, then to bring into view the women involved in anti-colonial movements, I think requires us to grapple with these gaps and these silences in the surviving records, which call into question the limits of a kind of only empiricist scholarship, I think, especially in the context of ongoing canonization of the great men of anti-colonial fights. And particularly, and this is not to undermine the work of those people. For example, I'm thinking of France Fanon or Amilcar Cabral, whose work is extremely powerful, but it's about the kind of rewriting of what was collective into histories of individual work. I think we can come back to that. So one person whose work I found very suggestive in thinking about these questions is the African-American critic Saidiya Hartman, who has argued for the need to describe as fully as possible, this is halfway down this quotation, to describe as fully as possible the conditions that determine the appearance of women in the empirical archive, and the conditions that dictate their silence. So what she's saying there is it's not just a question of going to whatever archive we're working in and finding the kind of fragments and just talking about them, but also of describing the conditions in which those fragments emerge or don't fully emerge. And I think that argument is extremely salient for thinking about why some things are and aren't there. And okay, so Saidiya Hartman is talking about how to talk about enslaved women whose voices were completely silenced. So it's not exactly the same situation, but I still think that there are things that we can take from this archive. And so that's why, rather than discussing the kind of gendered inequalities at Mensagem and in anti-colonial textual histories more broadly, in terms of only silence and voice, though I'll come on to that later, I want to begin by thinking in terms of division of labour. So to ask this question that is in the title of my talk, which is, where are the women? With that question in mind, I want to emphasise the role of women translators in these journals and in the broader research about journals that this paper is drawn on. So, for example, in the archives of Présence Africaine, this journal I've already mentioned, that was published from 1947 in Paris, in the archives there that I've worked on, where there are kind of reams and reams of manuscripts that have been sent in by men in the 50s and 60s proposing their texts be published in the journal. I found letters from women offering themselves as translators. you know, and including of Portuguese language material into French. So critics have stressed the role of translation in anti-colonial and post-colonial contexts. So Robert Young argues that nothing comes closer to the central activity and political dynamic of post-colonialism than the concept of translation. And Brent Hayes Edwards has written that if translations are, in the most basic sense, the practice of linguistic connection, then translation is one of the ways in which the turbine of the cultures of Black internationalism is lubricated. Okay, so translation is clearly and was indeed central to the comparative charge of anti-colonial print cultures, but it is important to emphasize that though the vast majority of published authors in those journals were men, the process of exchange that translation effected was made possible by their translators, of which many, though obviously not all, were women. I mean, Edwards' comments come as part of a discussion of the journal La Revue du Monde Noir, which was a kind of 1930, so it was published from 1931 by this woman, Paulette Nardal, and it was bilingual in English and in French. So that's one example that he's drawing on. But there are a lot of other examples of women translators of anti-colonial writing. So, for example, Constance. I mean, I don't know how useful it is for me to list loads and loads and loads, but to give you some examples, Amilcar Cabral's main translators into French were Dulce Amade, Sophie Mayou, and Chantal Thiebergen. Violante Ducant, who translated Castro Soromenyu. There's kind of reams and reams of names that I don't think are necessarily helpful for me to kind of reprise here, but the one I want to kind of land on is Noémie de Souza, who was, of course, the first translator into Portuguese of Aimé Césaire's Discours sur le colonialisme. So more broadly, in the existing archives of Mensagem, there aren't very many records of how the texts that came from abroad were translated and published into the journal. But I nevertheless think it's important to emphasize the work of Noémie de Souza. So I think that despite later attempts to kind of rehabilitate her work, I think that a sort of sense of disappointment often attends kind of critical accounts of her work. So sometimes this is because her work is deemed of little literary value. So there is sort of disparaging work that came out after her work was published in English. But otherwise, I think there is often a sense of disappointment connected to her perceived withdrawal from political work later in her life as a single mother in France. But one of the things that working in the journal, in the archives of this journal, have kind of brought forward to me is that that have kind of provoked me to kind of bring into question is just how quiet her later life was. So in 1965, this is the kind of actually this is not the same letter, but so there are lots of letters to her to Maria Pinto Andrade from France in the late 60s and in the 70s, in which she writes about her translations of African Lusophone poetry into French and her work with Christiane Diop at Présence Africaine. And then in 1974, this is the kind of letter that is kind of in front of you, that I'm not expecting you to read it, but she writes to Andrade in urgent terms to alert him to Sierra Nova's interest in publishing books about the MPLA and the PAIGC and Frelimo. And she herself was involved in translating Cabral's texts for the French radical publisher François Maspero. So I'm not going to talk now about her poetry, just for reasons of time, though I'll come on to that a bit later on. But I do, in thinking about this kind of question of divisions of literary labour, I also want to talk about her editorial practice. And so between late 1949 and April 1951, she was the editor of the women's page at the Mozambican journal O Brado Africano. And in that role, she played a proactive and explicit part in trying to construct and foster a critical readership for women of that page. So successive editorial, this is just a photograph of a kind of microfilm of the paper. So successive editorials that she writes kind of call on women who might be reading the paper to engage with her writing and to send their reactions to the articles that she's published. And crucially, I think one of the things she's trying to do is to expand the women's page beyond kind of received ideas of what women's interest kind of topics are. So here you can see this kind of article about cooking recalibrated with kind of literary writing. And so I think, and lots of her editorials take up questions of a kind of international dimension. She's talking about kind of stuff that's happening on the other side of the world. She's talking about political change. And so I think what she's doing there is troubling gendered divisions of intellectual and social labour there. And in a later interview, she said that she had been, her aim had been to turn the women's page into a page for everybody. So that is, you know, in a sense, she's trying to unpick the kind of marshalling, the marshalling of intellectual work along gendered lines. There's a lot of interesting work that I think is beginning to happen about women's magazines in the kind of anti-colonial, post-colonial context. And I just want to show you this picture, which is from the front of a Senegalese magazine called Awa, that was published in Dakar from 1964. And that actually published quite articles about PAIGC women in Guinea and Guinea-Bissau as well. But I just wanted to show you this photograph because I think it's such it's such a brilliant photograph that is a kind of perhaps a reimagining of what a cover girl could look like, I suppose, but also kind of helps bring into view the kind of new collective reading practices that kind of print press were kind of facilitating and that is so exciting about journal cultures in those years. So one thing I should say is that Sousa's work at O Brado Africano also kind of throws into relief the kind of omission of gender later at Mensagem, which published far fewer women than O Brado Africano, and that didn't itself kind of, she wasn't able to write in that way in that journal, which kind of troubles this idea that, you know, the kind of Eurocentric idea of feminism is something that begins in Europe, which obviously is not true. Sousa was also a central part of activities at the Centro dos Estudos Africanos, which was the reading and discussion group set up by Black students involved with Mensagem, and that was later memorialized in interviews given by Mário Pinto Andrade. And Andrade describes the kind of important literacy work and consciousness raising theatre that he and other students at the Casa staged with ship workers at the Clube Marítimo in Lisbon, which was a sphere of action that was clearly very important to him. You know, this was part of the kind of you know, going to the people kind of which was very important to him. And he talks about Sousa too, and about going to dances with her, and about how many men desired her. He writes, ela era pouco a nossa diva, era cortejada por nós todos. And so he's kind of presents her as this kind of ornamental figure in that in that political history, but he forgets to mention that it was her that translated the plays that they put on at the Clube Marítimo, and as such that it was her work that had enabled that particular moment of translinguistic and transnational exchange that was so important to his Pan-Africanist optic. In 1984, Sousa argued that telling the story of anti-colonial struggles through the individuated stories of their perceived leaders worked to occlude women who had worked alongside them. So she writes, penso que existe preconceito que consiste em atribuir papel preponderante em todas as atividades aos homens que nas lutas de libertação ou depois da independência das colônias portuguesas assumiram lugares de chefia. Dir-se-ia que esses homens nasceram predestinados, que uma estrela na testa os marcou desde o berço. So her critique here is directed not at the gendered dynamics of the group at the time, but at the retrospective erasure of women involved, and in the representation of contingency as teleology, and in the representation of collective work through the synecdoche of individuals. And I think that this synecdoche extends to ignoring the administrative, editorial and translation work that women affected in publishing literary texts. And this is something that I've also found in my work more recently on print journals in conakry, that there are lots of photographs of the kind of you know, the like editorial office and the print machines in conakry, and whilst the printed material doesn't bear any marks of women involved in those journals, in the photographs you see women doing the copying, doing the printing. And I think that part of understanding the gendered divisions of anti-colonial labour involve bringing those women back into a wider kind of literary scene of different kinds of work. I'm going to kind of slightly skip forward a little bit to say that one of the other, in line with that, one of the things about this work is that obviously a lot of the ways that women were involved in anti-colonial work were not literary in nature. So we see all these different names in the archives. We know that because of the ways in which the PID kept records on people, we still have this sense of these women that were there. So we know that that there was Marielle de Loujboil, who was the head of the flight school in Conakry, Carmen Pereira, who was an important PAIGC militant, Jean-Martin Cissé, who was a Pan-Africanist woman. All these women that come up, I think that there's been some really interesting work done on how to use these archives, because obviously when you're trying to reconstruct women's lives through the kind of optics of the police state, is extremely difficult to do that in a meaningful way. And I suppose I'm kind of coming on to the question of how we use the writing of people like Alda Espírito Santo and Noemi de Souza in that context. But in all of the cases of these women, who we can talk about a bit more, but I don't want to kind of drone on for absolutely hours, but that, you know, in a sense, these are women that come up in the anti-colonial sphere in those official state archives. And we know circumstantial things about their life. We know that, you know, Julieta Gandra was receiving magazines in Guinea-Bissau. We know all these things, but the opportunities to hear their voices are very slim. We don't know what they responded to how they responded to the things they read. We don't know what they felt about being in the places that they were observed being in. And yet the kind of paradox of this situation is that those archival fragments still remain important, because they offer us a glimpse into the fact that those women were there. But because of this elusiveness of those women's voices, I suppose this is one of the reasons why the literary and artistic works that do survive assume real value, even if the women that wrote them in anti-colonial contexts obviously represent a very particular and often decidedly middle-class demographic of anti-colonial women. So pages of PID documents record the movements of Alda Espírito Santo during the years that she lived in Lisbon, noting the times that she left home and returned, noting the activities it was possible to see her executing through the window of her flat, such as ironing. The PID recorded the housework that she did and the descriptions of guests who visited her. In the case of Manuela Margarido, they recorded conversations overheard in Paris, and that her husband, Alfredo Margarido, was a communist. And these kind of records are both banal deeply banal, but also horrifying because they make visible the surveillance that those women endured, as well as the normative conceptions of gendered behaviour that determined what the surveillance recorded. So they note that Alda Espírito Santo comes home very late, and they're very kind of disapproving of that, this kind of thing. They also demonstrate, I think, the enmeshments of women's daily lives in politics at the international and state level. But in contrast to many of the other women who I've got here, Espírito Santo and Margarido's literary texts provide fragments of their own voices with which to work and to begin to construct a counterpoint to the PID perspective. Nevertheless, I'm just kind of trying to remember what's next. Okay. Nevertheless, I suppose what I want to talk about here is the ways in which those texts, partly because of the paucity of texts that remain, are often called upon to be representative and to kind of speak to a more generalized experience. And that is, in the general absence of an archive of anti-colonial women's work, women poets and writers of fiction have often been called on to speak for women in general. And in particular, I think criticism of Noemi Souza's work and Alda Espírito Santo and Manuel Margarido's work have often emphasized the real social dimensions of their content. And this critical consensus about the political and social nature of those writers' work is in some ways correct. They represent, as Laura Padilha argues in relation to Espírito Santo, the poetry of solidarity. But reading those texts predominantly to plug the gaps in archival records of women's lives is limited in usefulness. I think that treating them as positivist sources underplays them as literary texts and underemphasizes the dissonances and the ambivalences and also the sophistication of the poems themselves. So, for example, reading Alda do Espírito Santo's work as one critic does, as porta-vozes for silenced Black women everywhere, leaves us unable to make sense of the silences and the distances in her work between the poetic voice and her often reticent characters. In this last section of this talk, I'm going to just look at some of the texts as poetic responses to this question of silence, and to suggest that and to suggest ways in which we can start to read them. So Espírito Santo's poems, I think, repeatedly foreground the silence of their characters. So in Lá no Água Grande, for example, the poetic voice describes a distant scene where Black women are washing clothes on the rocks and laughing and singing. It's a kind of happy, it's a vivid scene with children playing, and the river is also kind of singing. But we can't hear what they're saying. Their stories are arrastados pelo vento. And as they return to the plantation at the end of the poem, the women fall silent. So in offering us this glimpse of a world that she cannot access, the poet positions herself and her readers as partial voyeurs, unable to hear or see the full reality, but aware that there is something that they can't access. So in Para Lá da Praia, published in Mensagem in 1959, the poetic voice calls on a child to express itself that doesn't. And this happens again and again in Avó Mariana, published in 1963. The poetic voice again entreats her interlocutor, this time an old woman, to tell her story, but neither character speaks. The child stays silent and Avó Mariana has forgotten her past. So in all of these cases, the poet is unable to access their stories, foregrounding the extent to which the poet cannot act as a spokeswoman. So clearly these are interventions, poetic interventions, on the question of silencing of African women, but it cannot be said that they approach that question by attempting to write an empirical record of women's speech. So the poetic strategy here is precisely not to put words in women's mouths, but rather to harness silence as a trope in order to attest to the existence of women whose words we can no longer hear. And I think that, so Alda Espírito Santo also wrote an essay in Mensagem called Luares da África, in which she calls for the kind of liberation of African women. But again, she's very explicit there about her inability to fully access the lives and thoughts of those women. And so I think that in a way her writing should be seen as both empirical records, but really philosophical and poetic meditations on the place of African women in the world. And I think, do I have time for one last example, Louisa?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So this is Manuela Margarido's poem Memoria da Ilha do Príncipe. And I'm just showing you the, okay. So this is just a photograph of how it was published in Mensagem. And this poem too is also built around the tension between a speaking poetic voice and a silent woman, who in this case is the speaker's mother. So the poem's opening lines kind of gesture to a certain realism. Mai tu pagavas charro com a água das ribeiras. But the poem quickly leaves this kind of suggestion of realism behind to take on this surreal and otherworldly aesthetic. Things turn into each other, they change colour, and they take on strange proportions and resemblances. The landscape and the mother's body blur into one another. And though she never speaks, the mother is an active presence, bursting through the trees, descending over her daughter and perfuming her memories. In a parenthetic aside, I think I've just got a photograph here of Manuela Margarida so you can see when she was old. But in this aside here about the poetic voice reimagines Pico, who is a figure of Greek myth endowed with the power of prophecy, alongside the palms, mangoes, and kapok trees of Sao Tome. And at this and at other points in the poem, the text kind of holds up different modes of powerful speech: testimony, elegy, storytelling, prayer, spell, prophecy, whose sort of tenors that the poem intones at different points. And at the end of the poem, the speaker claims the powers of prophecy and magic for her and for her mother, who throw themselves into the mutating and resistive dreamscape around them. So Margarido's surrealist aesthetics do not offer a rationalist account of the silencing of African women. Rather, her texts emphasizes its speaker's dreams, subjectivity, and ability to summon different registers, to figure the mother not in tragic terms as a poor and silent woman collecting fish, but rather to reimagine her cast in this scene of sensuous self-sovereignty, at one with the landscape and in a world away from male-sponsored emancipation, which is Priya Gopal's term. So Margarido's surrealism centers the present power of her speaking subject to reimagine the historical record. So to conclude, I think I would like to say that there's a kind of increase, well, I don't know if it's increasing, I wonder what you will think about this, but there is a strand of kind of critical pushback on the focus of kind of fictional Black women. So for example, Bell Hooks, the African-American theorist, has complained that, and I quote, "theoretical feminist writing by women of colour is often ignored, and attention is given rather to works of fiction or confessional autobiographical writing," close quotes. But I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that, is that fictional and poetic works are themselves forms of thought, and that we need to take, and that we're not faced with a kind of stark choice between theoretical writing and fictional writing in our kind of intellectual histories of that moment in the 20th century. And more broadly to say, this is one of the things I think where journals can kind of, I think the journals are very suggestive here. And taking journals and literary journals as a major creative practice in their own right in this moment of decolonization brings into view a much more densely packed terrain of literary and artistic work that if we only focus on book publishing we can't see. But one of the things about journals is that they are not just they're not equally distributed. They are, in the words of Fiona Green, who is an English literary critic, unstable compounds. And I think that this is a useful image, unstable compounds, because it helps us think about the work of suturing and of sewing together that publishing each journal involves. And that publishing each edition of Mensagem would have involved the calls for submissions, the reception of pieces, the editing, correspondence, translation, layout, the sending of a mock-up to the printers, the distribution of copies, and so on. And so if we think with this unstable compound and look at who was doing which part of that compound, I think we begin to see a lot more literary practice as well in that scene. And also that they are a form of text that have cracks built into them. And I think that reading for cracks and fragments, as well as consensus, becomes an important way of understanding the journal's form. And so I think attending to those fragments, as well as to the divisions of labour of the unstable compound, can help us to answer the question that I began with, which is, where are the women? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.